Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Cyrus Zargar, and it is my great pleasure to introduce our accomplished speaker today, whose lecture is titled Opening Pandora's Box, AI, ChatGPT and the Mystery of Consciousness, hosted by UCF's Al-Ghazali Program in Islamic Studies in the Department of Philosophy. Dr. Muhammad Faruque is assistant professor and a Taft Center Fellow at the University of Cincinnati. He earned his PhD with distinction from the University of California, Berkeley, and served as exchange scholar at Harvard University and as George Ames postdoctoral fellow at Fordham University. His highly acclaimed book, Sculpting the Self, addresses what it means to be human in a secular post-Enlightenment world by exploring notions of selfhood and subjectivity in Islamic and non-Islamic philosophies, including modern philosophy and neuroscience. Dr. Faruque is the author of 3 books and over 40 academic articles. He has also delivered lectures at many North American, European, Asian, and Middle Eastern universities. We are delighted to have him here, however, virtually at our own. Dr. Faruque will speak for around 40 minutes, followed by a question and answer portion. Those questions should be left in the dedicated Q&A chat function of Zoom. If you're on a desktop, you should see it at the bottom of your screen, not in the chat. Thank you for attending and for any questions you might have. And with that, I turn it over to our speaker, Dr. Faruque.
Thank you, Dr. Zargar. Thank you for that very kind introduction. And thanks for having me on this platform. So let me begin by sharing the screen. And let me put the slides, because I have some slides. Yes, I believe the slides are on, and I believe everyone can see them. Dr. Zargar, can you? Yeah, I think, yeah, yes. You can confirm, right? Yeah, great. Just making sure. All right. So my talk is entitled Opening Pandora's Box, AI, ChatGPT, and the Mystery of Consciousness. I mean, this topic needs no introduction because everybody is talking about ChatGPT these days on various media. So, so is it really as impressive and revolutionary as they claim, or is it more about money, power, attention seeking, and getting rich at the end of the day? To my mind, it really reminds us of the Faustian bargain of trying to achieve greatness at the expense of our soul. So, because, and I'm going to explain why I think so. But before I do that, it has to be, things have to be unpacked systematically and have to explain some of the terms and also how I'm going to proceed in this talk. So here's the structure of the talk. But you can sense that I'm going to take a very critical look at this topic and what's going on, unlike most of the stuff that we're hearing. So anyway, so we have two parts in this talk. The first part, I'm going to do a diagnosis of the problem of AI and briefly touching on issues like economic inequality and what some people have called pancake self or flattening of the self, and then Eurocentrism, AI colonialism, digital dictatorship, and then finally, and then AI and its relation to consciousness. And then in the second part, I'm going to lay out a possible way forward, basically arguing why it is really impossible to have an AI with human level consciousness, because that seems to be the overarching claim in addition to all other enthusiasm surrounding it. So I thought I would actually begin with this quote, the formal talk, if you like. So this is a quote from Silicon Valley guru, actually. Some of you might know Jaron Lanier, and he was one of the pioneers of virtual reality back in the 80s. And so he wrote this book, You're Not a Gadget, and you have this quote. And I have a very provocative question to begin with as well. Did the search engine really know what you're looking for? Because these people seem to be thinking the search engine can determine what in fact we want to look for, whatever we want to learn, everything. So Lanier says, quote, "You can't tell if a machine has," just a moment. "You can't tell if a machine has gotten smarter or if you have just lowered your own standards of intelligence to such a degree that the machine seems smart. If you can have a conversation with a simulated person presented by an AI program, can you tell how far you have let your sense of personhood degrade in order to make the illusion work for you?" End of quote. So to me, this really summarizes what is happening with all of this ChatGPT business. But because many people are saying it has passed the Turing test, the famous test Turing has developed, where you'll be having a conversation with a machine, and if you're not able to tell it's a machine or not, then the machine has passed. But in any event, this is a very contentious point. So let me kind of put this up here before moving further. And then, but as I said, there are some basic concepts that we need to explain. So before I really get into the kind of main points of contention, I want to make clear what we mean by AI, what we mean by ChatGPT, and all of this. And also, there are some benefits, there are some good things definitely with respect to this technology, as with all technologies. So I'll also kind of try to outline them for getting the main topic. So these days, OpenAI's ChatGPT, Google's Bard, and Microsoft Sydney, they're really some of the marvels of machine learning. So roughly speaking, when it comes to ChatGPT, so these language programs, models, they take huge amounts of data, and then they search for patterns in it and become increasingly proficient at generating statistically probable outputs, such as seemingly human-like language and thought. And so as some of you might know, they already came up with the next version, which is called GPT-4. It's available in limited version. But there's really, all right, before getting further, two more definitions. So when it comes to AI, again, there are multiple, different definitions one can offer, but people basically think about two different types of AI. One is called strong AI, and the other one is called weak AI. So weak AI is also called the narrow AI. It's an AI system that's designed to design and train for a particular task. For example, virtual personal assistant, Apple Siri, and those things that we're familiar with. But when it comes to strong AI or artificial general intelligence, it's an AI system with generalized human cognitive abilities. Basically, it can do what humans can do. So the idea, the assumption is that at some point, not in the not so distant future, we should be able to, because we already have weak AI, its various applications that we are familiar with, even things like computer vision. But very soon we should be able to develop even strong AI, which will basically meaning we'll have machines that are no different from human beings in terms of their cognitive capabilities. They will be also conscious and sentient and so forth. So yeah, before getting into, as I said, I really can't wait to get into the part where we begin to talk about consciousness. But definitely, I do agree that when it comes to ChatGPT or AI in general, there are certain benefits that it's just hard to deny. So, for example, with ChatGPT, it can definitely help us improve our scientific research, can optimize academic training. It can also help us be more creative because it has access to such a large amount of data. And then it can do some of these things like summarizing literature, improving scientific papers in general, and also write computer code. So I know there are people like aeronautic engineers who constantly use AI to perform their tasks. So it is kind of already part of our life and doing really very sophisticated work. And then, as I said, when it comes to weak AI, we can already say its applications in customer service. I'm sure everyone is familiar with when sometimes they need to talk to someone at the bank and there's no one, or initially at some kind of computer program response to our queries. So, and then there's computer vision. There's talk of electric cars. There's also even something called affective computing, which can help human beings with respect to certain disorders like autism and so forth. But more than that, all of these kind of general benefits, some people are claiming it's like the Enlightenment of the 18th century. It's going to radically change our perceptions of the world and basically everything we do. So that's a huge claim, and it's going to affect our freedom and so forth. So whether that's the case or not, I mean, remains to be seen. But there's reason to be skeptical about that kind of about that kind of claim, where people are saying it's basically something like the discovery, invention of electricity. Anyway, so those are some of the benefits of AI. I'm not and just to kind of elaborate on that a little bit more. When it comes to education, I think there is a real potential, and I'm not denying that. So if you're familiar, I'm sure some of you are familiar with Saul Khan Academy, and which founded by Saul Khan, and the stuff that he's doing. So providing education to a lot of different countries and people in places where they have no access to education. So AI can, and especially ChatGPT and the next version, they can play a very important role, I guess. So I'm not denying those benefits. But people also talk about potential dangers, threats of AI. Again, I'm just going to provide an outline because I just don't want us to give us the impression that I'm talking about. My talk is broad enough because I know I'm talking to a broad audience, and I will try to be as accessible as possible. And I'll still try to focus on something particular, namely whether it will ever be possible. So we're basically talking about the future of humanity with respect to all of these technologies. But I just felt like I need to at least provide some kind of introductory material, introductory explanations of how these things work and some of the benefits and threats in general, without kind of elaborating on them too much. Anyway, so just as there are a lot of benefits people are talking about in hyperbolic terms, there are also threats that people are talking about, experts and on various media. So there are people who are talking about terrorism and how if it falls into the wrong hand, this can become a huge danger, as with nuclear weapons and those. Actually, the analogy with nuclear weapons is so appropriate, I guess. Actually, one of the very influential computer scientists, namely Yoshua Bengio, one of the perhaps the most highly cited person when it comes to computer science and deep learning, one of the really fathers of deep learning, things that have given birth to this kind of technology. He actually compares the threats associated with AI to nuclear weapons. And then other people have pointed out how it falls in the wrong hand. And if you ask ChatGPT or these kind of programs to kind of make a bomb and to make kind of virus like COVID-19 and those kind of things, and it being just a machine, sometimes can be manipulated into doing this kind of really catastrophic activities. And then there's also this phenomena, I'm sure some of us have noticed already. So there's something called deep fake AI. So especially, I can give you this example. So on TikTok, there's this guy called Unreal Keanu, famous actor Keanu Reeves. So it's a kind of deep, it's a fake of Keanu Reeves. It's not real. That it's called. It's explicit on the account Unreal Keanu. But it's so believable that if you have to really watch a number of times some of these videos to really make sure to really understand that this is not the real actor. And more than that, there are people who actually don't want to, who really simply don't care. So these videos are having now millions of viewers. So this itself is an amazing phenomenon. People, for a large number of people, simply don't seem to care about reality anymore in a way. And then people also have mentioned authoritarianism, how in the hands of authoritarian governments, these technologies can be, can really do a lot of damage. And then I already mentioned AI colonialism, digital dictatorship, and what some people would say loss of humanity, because we're losing touch with our inner self, and kind of looking at things in terms of the functional use, which is what some people have defined technology, the very nature of technology. So in this talk, I'm not, obviously, as I said, not going to be focusing on all of these things, but a couple of related points, such as loss of humanity, Eurocentrism, and how we think about nature and human beings. Really, the kind of big questions. So just one more point. So there are a lot of studies that have shown how this kind of technology is widening the productivity gap, and it's creating what some people have called algorithmic workforce. You have a large number of people today working under the AI, and a very few people on top who don't need to even meet these people at the bottom, especially if you think about Uber, Amazon, those kind of companies. So it's leading to K-shaped graph favoring high-skilled workers, and at the same time making life ever more difficult for the average worker. And there are also studies, again, these are very controversial, so I don't want to kind of say the final word regarding this. So some people would say the rising inequality that we are noticing in the last 10, 20 years is due largely to this kind of technologies, but there are also studies that contend that regardless, some negative impact on the employment, on economic, on the labor market is it's just undeniable. Anyway, so there are all of these issues with respect to ChatGPT or AI in general. And in a talk like this, obviously, I'm not, as I said, I'll not be able to focus on all of every single one of them. But I do want to focus on the question of AI and its relationship to consciousness, because this is one place where even the experts. So first of all, there are all of these people who are claiming, oh, we're just 10, 15 years away from creating AGI, as I said, machines with human level consciousness. Not just that, even ASI, artificial super intelligence, where just like in sci-fi films, machines are going to kind of exceed human intelligence, and human beings basically will be ruled by machines, just as you see in The Matrix or in other films, or machines becoming self-aware, simply put. So, so there are a lot of such AI enthusiasts, especially people like Ray Kurzweil, or even philosophers like Nick Bostrom. But when you really consult the writings of computer scientists or people who are working in the field of deep learning, like Yoshua Bengio and the likes of him, they are quite skeptical. In fact, Bengio, for example, directly said, these are sort of stuff that make more sense in the context of these claims, I mean, in the context of sci-fi films, but not when it comes to the real scenario, because we still don't know the real, we really don't know what's going on with respect to AI, much of AI research, and it will take more than one expert to really figure out what will be the future. But even here, in principle, when it comes to in principle, what do some of these people, the very experts who gave birth to this technology through deep learning, are thinking? It's surprising. Even people like Bengio and other people working in the field, they think actually it's in principle it's possible to develop human level consciousness with machines. We just need to, but they're also aware of the kind of side effects or the potential negative consequences. So they do warn of having more regulation, so forth. But at the same time, things like inserting, putting human emotions like compassion into the machine or something. I don't know how can you even think about that, but these are what some of the experts are saying. Now, I find it really, really, really amazing that even when it comes to non-experts, you might say, yeah, these are people working in the field. Maybe, they just want more attention, because if you keep talking about these things more and more, or if you simply subscribe, they benefit. So the more we talk about, the more we pay attention, that's what they want. The revenues go up instantly, and it's no secret. When it comes to world's most the kind of biggest companies with the largest share of money and income and revenues, it's usually the tech companies in the top 10 or something. But even the real experts seem to be believing that in principle, we should be able to develop machines with human level consciousness. Now, to even talk about that, I mean, I personally feel this is just amazing, not to mention all the consequences. So yeah, let's focus on that, whether it will ever be possible to develop human level consciousness. So, but regardless of whether we are able to develop human level AI with human level consciousness, or AGI, there's no doubt that the internet is already having its impact on us. It's already blurring the line between human intelligence and devices, because individuals are more, they're trying to define their selfhood and their abilities in terms of what they're seeing or learning from Google, to put it that way. In other words, they're taking on the quality of machines. So there's already something of kind of mechanization of the human selfhood that is happening. So this phenomenon is leading to what Richard Foreman calls the pancake self. So it's and what is the pancake self? The pancake self is spread wide and thin as we connect with the vast network information accessed by the mere touch of a button, while losing some touch with our rich inner complexity and cultural heritage. So there's very little doubt today that for a lot of people, AI seems to be actually reshaping our very identity, because we depend on Google or we depend on AI on so many things already, not to speak of the future where some people are saying we'll actually be tutored by, we'll be educated by AIs. We'll not need real teachers anymore because AI can do whatever we need from schools, colleges, and even when it comes to real education. So this is a really frightening situation, and because it, on the one hand, does allow us to gain some information about the world and so forth, but at the same time, as I pointed out, it kind of makes us more forgetful of our inner self. And that leads to all kinds of other issues. And there are all of these sociological studies. So like how this disconnect between human beings with nature, with the real world, and with themselves are causing a lot of these mental health issues. But beyond that, when it comes to human self, people are simply assuming that we're just biological machines. People are comfortable today to identify themselves with the human brain, with the brain alone, or with machines. They call themselves biological machines, and they think the mind works exactly like the machine, and there's nothing more. So this is really the flattening of the self, because when we begin to ask what is consciousness, what is self, so I'll show you some diagrams now and begin to kind of talk about the nature of consciousness. They really show us the complexity of human mind, how human mind works, and how that is very different from how machines function. And in saying all of this now, I know I've already tried to cover a lot of ground, but this is the kind of main point of contention between what I'm trying to argue and what most people, on the other hand, I know I'm kind of going against the grain because most people seem to be, even as I say, intelligent people seem to be convinced that we're not very far from actually building machines in human consciousness. All right, so I actually have, I think, about 20 some minutes, so I'll move to part two. But just one more slides about in the first part. So when people are talking about this kind of technology, when people are talking about it being a kind of ushering in a new enlightenment and kind of revolutionize society and so forth, if you think about these things deeply, you know that there are a lot of assumptions. There's a kind of philosophical worldview in place that has all of these assumptions about the definition of the human being, definition of the world, of nature, of the universe, or how the world works, and the relationship between human beings, and with nature. And people think that, but nobody seems to be kind of questioning some of these assumptions, which are very problematic. So I call this Google's philosophy of Google sort of kind of, tech for all of these different AI technologies. So Google's philosophy of transcendence. So there are people like Larry Page, for example, saying, oh, the ultimate search engine is something as smart as people. And then Sergey Brin saying, certainly, if you had all the world's information directly attached to your brain, or an artificial brain that was smarter than your brain, or that was smarter than your brain, you'd be better off. And then, of course, there are people like Kurzweil and others who are talking about singularity and a transhumanist future, basically creating spiritual machines, or basically living in an age in the not so deep. Actually, they have been predicting this since the beginning of this century, actually, since 2021. And saying, oh, by 2030, we'll have already developed, but 2030 is actually very near. And so it's worth pointing out how many times their predictions have actually already failed. But nonetheless, they're kind of envisioning a future where there'll be a point where human beings, human brains, human minds, and machines will merge together, and potentially you'll be able to upload your brains. So I just saw news that the CEO of this OpenAI, which came up with ChatGPT. I think his name is Sam Altman, and he already kind of paid a startup $10,000 to upload his brain when he dies, or so that consistently forever, something like that. So they're also already envisioning that kind of future, which you see in sci-fi films, actually. So it's amazing that many people seem to be believing that this is already real, and the mind is works just like a software, or it's just like a kind of computer file can be uploaded, and you can simply connect yourself to the brain and somehow access all the world's information and so forth. But there is a business side of things, as I said. The more you engage, pay attention to these things, the richer they become. That is just undeniable. So no wonder why you want to create also headlines about these things. But more importantly, this kind of information technology, they carry an underlying ethics, a set of assumptions about the nature of consciousness and intelligence. So it's worth really focusing on these things, on the nature of consciousness and intelligence, and really figure out whether consciousness is simply something machine-like, something that can be manipulated and predicted and can be inserted into a machine, or consciousness and intelligence as well are phenomena that are by definition beyond just these machines can do. So to talk about consciousness, to talk about intelligence, you have to also begin with the term self, because the self, it's in the context of the self that talking about human consciousness makes sense. So the self, again, is a very complicated term, but at its simple level, when I say self, it can simply mean moment-to-moment subjective experience, or the sense of being an I, or having a self-concept at a deeper level, having some kind of self-understanding, or even at a deeper level, at a further on, having something like self-esteem and so forth. And there are all sorts of ways you can talk about the human self. So this is something we just perhaps we don't hear much when it comes to these online conversations on various interviews and things that are happening on the internet, on YouTube. So I have actually written a book on this. So I'm not going to go into all of these details, but basically when it comes to the human self, there are many different ways you can talk about it. So I have a chart here. Basically, the details of all this can be found in my book entitled Sculpting the Self. If you're interested, you can simply Google it. And then I also put forward a humble theory about it. Again, it's very complex. So this is the architectonic of the self, having all kinds of different dimensions: biophysiological, sociocultural, cognitive, experiential, ethical, spiritual, and so forth. But to come to this diagram in the form of elaborate and coherent theory takes a great deal of kind of discussion and arguments and back and forth. So this is found in the book, so I'm not going to discuss this. But I only broached it because I thought this would be a good starting point as we talk about so here are more diagrams as we talk about consciousness. So so what is consciousness? And so you can see I have quite a few different diagrams. And why am I claiming that it's nearly impossible for us to conceive of machines with consciousness? Because consciousness does not. So to begin with, if you just even provide a laundry list of the features of consciousness, you begin to see how complicated it is that escapes simple conversations. So already in the features of consciousness, you can see there's the idea that consciousness is primary or fundamental in the order of reality. So everything that we think of, even the fact that we're now currently watching at a computer screen, and listening to someone talking, and the fact that I'm giving this talk, all of these even very basic activities presuppose some kind of human consciousness, not to mention complicated experiments and scientific research, and also when we're involved in mathematical activity, mathematical thinking and so forth. All of these things presuppose consciousness. So in contrast to the materialistic idea that it's matter which gives rise to consciousness, there can actually be very powerful arguments. And again, in this talk, I cannot get into the very the more complicated arguments regarding this, but I'm trying to make sense of this at a more intuitive level, that when you think about the world, the universe as a whole, it's perhaps not too far-fetched. Actually, it should come more naturally to us to think that consciousness is actually more fundamental than matter. Actually, the very notion of matter is contained in one's consciousness and not the other way around. But there can be more philosophical arguments, and if people can ask if people ask in the Q&A, I can provide more elaborate arguments. But there are people, philosophers, who do believe and argue that consciousness is fundamental in the order of reality. And then there's the question of self-luminosity. So now think about, let me explain this very quickly in terms of an example. So think about being in a very dark room. The room is so dark that you're not able to even see your own body. You're barely able to stand on the ground, but you're not able to see literally nothing. So even if you had the most powerful cameras, it will not provide you with any data. But even in that situation, no one would deny that they have some knowledge of themselves. They are aware of the fact that they're aware. In other words, they're conscious of themselves even in that situation. Moreover, they're conscious of the fact that they have some spatio-temporal location. They're standing on somewhere. So consciousness is actually light, and that's proven in this kind of examples. Even in the darkest of the situations, you have consciousness acting as a light, giving you some sense of who you are in that context. So consciousness is by definition self-luminous. It kind of sheds light on not only just like physical lights on objects around you, but also it can shed light upon itself. So you become self-aware. And with it comes self-knowledge, self-awareness. So that's kind of self-cognizance. And then a reflexivity. So some of these features are very much related. And I'm not going to go into the details, so I can explain each and every one of them. But you have features like reflexivity, again, only possible in the context of human consciousness. Turning on the self upon the self, turning your gaze inward, and then looking at yourself as a self. That kind of reflexive act is only possible with human consciousness. And then the fact that we have introspection through which we have some knowledge and we can introspect a lot of things, again, very unique quality. And then down the line, subjective experience like qualia, or what it is likeness, to see red as red, to feel pain as pain, and then not to mention more abstract features such as unity, indivisibility, irreducibility, multimodality, first-person givenness, dynamic flow, continuous presence. So these are some of the, as I've been thinking about this issue, I was able to kind of think at least about, there can be even more features. Some of them are kind of very much related to one another. But this should give us some intuition about consciousness as we begin to talk about it. This is not just about the list. You can actually explain how all of these actually very much apply to consciousness. From another perspective, if you think about human consciousness in the context of the human self, you have basically, in my understanding, in my typology, which I explain at length again in the book, there are three different ways you can talk about it. There is, first of all, reflective consciousness, which is reflexivity, turning your gaze upon yourself and being aware that you are aware, just like seeing yourself in the mirror, or just simply the fact that being aware that you are aware. I know, I'm sure people are able to understand that. And then into subjective consciousness, sorry. And then like being conscious of others and others being conscious of us. And then there's a further level, which is called non-reflective, which is actually more fundamental. So you can think about various philosophical phenomenological arguments, but for the sake of simplicity, I would just cite some examples of non-reflective consciousness, such as when we have a dreamless sleep, or when we are in a state of drunkenness, when there's no self-awareness, but when the drunkenness is over and you come back to your normal state, or when you wake up from a dreamless sleep, you remember that you had slept peacefully without any problem, like agitation in your brain or like dreams or anything. Similarly, you remember your drunken state. So there is a state of consciousness that even precedes reflective consciousness. The reason, again, why I'm saying all of this is to point out that when you think about consciousness, it's very complex and it's multimodal, and there are features that you cannot even talk about in relation to machines. But people seem to, what we seem to be doing is to pin down or focus only on the computational aspect of our consciousness, the mathematical function of our mind or the self. I'll come to that point when I talk about intelligence in a moment. But we seem to be having this reductionist view of the self and consciousness, and we seem to be thinking, oh, through all of these neural networks, deep learning methods and algorithm models, we can kind of successfully replicate human consciousness. But that's just, people who have studied this. Again, I'm talking about these things based on not just one random individuals sitting somewhere in Cincinnati in the States, but drawing on intuitions, insights, arguments concerning human consciousness from several years, 1,000 years of reflections on these topics from multiple traditions, non-Western and Western traditions, Buddhism, for example, Islamic philosophy, and in Greek philosophy, and so forth. Because we're talking about consciousness and we're talking about replicating consciousness, people at least should take the trouble, perhaps, to see if they're thinking whatever they're thinking, it's kind of thinking inside the bubble, or there's some serious stuff that is kind of eluding their mind. So you talk about consciousness in these terms, and you begin to see how complex it is beyond what even today Western philosophers are talking about, some of which I already mentioned, like what it is likeness. But consciousness is, it's a global issue. It's not like how it's not going to be settled just by people in one continent or something. And that's, again, something related to AI colonialism, and people seem to be so enthusiastic about this. But if you pay close attention, most of the time the data that we're talking about, this huge amount of data, they're only coming from a certain period in history and certain continent, you might say. And the moment we try to explore these topics of selfhood and consciousness, we're being provided with data points, theories that may only be coming from what's called Europe today, or simply Western civilization. I'm not denying that there's nothing worthwhile about that. Of course, there's plenty of things you can learn, but it may be the case that the non-Western civilization, non-Western traditions may offer some really interesting facts about these very things, concepts, ideas like intelligence and consciousness that may change the way we think about it. And in fact, because these issues are now, you can't avoid AI in your day-to-day life. So these things come with enormous social and ethical implications. And yet, to think about ethics in the context of these topics, you need to have more data points. Because I personally think we need to think more globally about this. So I'm by definition, my philosophy is based on what I call cross-cultural philosophy. It's not just based on the perspective of one given tradition, which may have some worthwhile things to offer. But there are plenty of other traditions that can offer things that will apply to people around the world. But with the internet, with the search engine, most of the time when you when it comes to maybe people just trying to figure out the definition of these terms like personhood, selfhood, consciousness. They're only getting answers from one perspective alone. Anyway, I don't want to belabor that point very much. So talking about the nature of consciousness a bit more. So you have consciousness as the fundamental, as in the order of reality, more fundamental than a matter or anything else, which can be defined in terms of absolute consciousness. And then you have in this diagram empirical consciousness. And between absolute and empirical consciousness, you have these other levels. Sometimes can be called subtle consciousness, meaningful dreams, and sometimes inspirations. At other times, unconscious drives, impulses, hidden. So you think about human self, you think about the nature of consciousness, and those of us who have some exposure to psychology, we know these things are just part and parcel of human phenomena. And you can see how you cannot simply talk about machines in terms of these particular features of consciousness. Anyway, I think I only have a few more minutes, so I'll try to wrap things up. So similar to consciousness, similar to the features of consciousness, the self or the mind also has very complicated features, some which can be replicated in the machines, especially the mathematical or computational aspect. But when it comes to features like intentionality, intuition, understanding, wisdom, moral conscience, aesthetic judgment, impulses, and tendencies, drives, emotions, senses, I mean, I don't see how that can ever be possible. Because we don't even seem to understand what we're talking about. Consciousness is not simply a computational feature of the brain or something. There are proofs even on in that context, like Roger Penrose using Gödel's incompleteness theorem to argue against that kind of mathematical modeling of consciousness. But beyond that, human beings are an aggregate of some of the negative qualities, tendencies. So it's just hard to think how you can replicate all of these things in the context of machine. But more than that, talking about consciousness will make you think about life as well, existence as well. These are kind of inseparable phenomena. And you begin to see it's not like how we can talk about human consciousness or human life without thinking about life in general in nature. So you can see the picture gets more and more complicated with life, consciousness, existence kind of coming together. Anyway, so I think, I just have so many slides, and I know this is a complex issue, but I just feel I have to rush. So similar to consciousness, you can't separate intelligence from consciousness. What is happening with the AI business at a simple level is that people are kind of thinking only about what I would call analytical or problem-solving, decision-making, that particular aspect of consciousness. But intelligence is also about synthetic ability to put together things, like what does it all mean? What is the nature of reality? So there are theories of intelligence I know that talks about multiple functions of intelligence, but it's still that falls short of what I call the synthetic ability of intelligence. So here's another diagram. So intelligence can be understood in terms of what in Islamic philosophy called partial intelligence, or the reasoning faculty, computational faculty. But it can also be discussed in terms of all-inclusive or universal intelligence, akal kulli. So a lot of conversation that we can have today with ChatGPT about moral issues. So it was asked, for example, whether it's important to preserve the natural condition in other planets like Mars. Most of the time, it will provide us with kind of responses that will kind of talk about advantages or disadvantages, kind of back and forth. And then it will often say, oh, as an AI, I don't have a personal perspective because I just follow orders. I'm just following orders. But that's precisely the point. When it comes to human intelligence, there's the synthetic ability. What does it all mean? Where are we going on all this? What is the very nature of reality? That question is natural to our intelligence. So you can then ask, can machines really think? In contrast to Turing. The human mind, the answer is, as far as I'm aware, the answer is no. The human mind is not a lumbering statistical engine like ChatGPT. That becomes clear when when you think about examples and think about how a child acquires language, it has what some people have called innate operating system, innate universal grammar. It works not with a large amount of data, but a small amount of data, but yet capable of coming up with right syntax and most of the time, and develops language, which linguists later, when they analyze, it's mind-boggling how children can do this. And then more than that, thinking is not just description and prediction. The deepest flaw in these models are the people who simply think they can simply replicate human thinking. And again, I'm just giving examples that are easy to follow. Honestly, this should require us to really go deep into philosophy, read metaphysics and epistemology in various philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, Avicenna, Kant, and so forth, to really understand the structure of the mind, how when we think something, what are the tools that is involved? It's not just the brain. The brain is just one component in this. So thinking is not description prediction. It's not just about stating what is the case, what was the case, or what will be the case. That's all description or prediction. But also, what is not the case, what could and could not be the case. So think about the example, the apple falls. That's a description. And you can kind of go further. You can say the apple falls if I open my hand. Again, that's a description and a prediction. The apple falls at the moment whenever I open my hand. So yeah, that will make sense on some level. But when it comes to but AI or ChatGPT, as far as at least at this point, would stop at that. It will not be able to provide us with something like the apple falls because of the force of gravity. It will not be able to provide our curvature of space-time as in general relativity. So it's one thing to describe and predict, and quite another to come up with a physical law, and also understand the impossible scenarios, and are able to provide causal explanations. So that's just one simple example. There are way more complicated examples that you can cite that actually will show that human mind is way more now human mind, I mean, not just individual, one person here and there, human mind as in human collectivity. It's way more complicated than machines, even though there are things that machines are doing that are clearly outperforming our human beings, like with even calculators. You can see that, not to mention a lot of complicated software. And with ChatGPT, obviously, there are things that machines will be able to do with its, because it has access to all of this data, and human beings generally cannot work with that kind of data at one point in time. So there will be those things where, AI is outperforming. But if you think about the nature of human consciousness and all of its dimensions, then it becomes very clear, wow, there is a lot to human consciousness, human selfhood, than simply the pancake self, just this flattening out of the self, where you simply think of it in terms of a biological machine, and we don't seem to notice anything underneath. And the consequences, social, moral, spiritual, are just huge. So to recover to that kind of, to recover our real selfhood, what we need in place of over enthusiasm, not that we cannot do, not that I'm kind of totally in favor and like I'm asking people to just simply shut down all this technology. That's not possible. But if we really think about human life, the pillars, what makes life worthwhile, there has to be some kind of self-understanding, self-knowledge. And so I would emphasize self-exploration, contemplative practices, spending time with oneself, and kind of reining in our and kind of regulating our time with technology. So yeah, there are all of these spiritual practices we can kind of perform, and they will also lead us to this idea of seeing consciousness, life, existence as an interconnected phenomena. It will also help us to see, overcome what I call overcome the Cartesian dualism of mind and matter. That is really at the heart of most of these enthusiastic comments. So the self, in my understanding, is both anthropocosmic and anthropocentric. And it's the cosmos and the self, the universe, nature, and the self or soul are not two separate entities at the end of the day. They're two sides of the same coin, a coin that was minted in the divine image. So the environmental implications of such a view is very obvious. And I mentioned this because I know, this kind of discussions at some point, on some level, has to involve some complex discussions of history of science as well. That's just unavoidable. When I think about this, when I think about what's going on today, despite the fact that I'm not against technology, but I'm aware, because I do have some training in the history of science. And so those people who have studied the history of science, they know how the scientific revolution, and thanks to Galileo and Descartes, I'm saying this rather, parodying them in a way, their kind of dualistic view and primary, secondary qualities, that distinction, it led to this mind-matter dualism, ultimately paved the way to a lot of things, kind of control and domination over nature. That was actually explicitly mentioned in it. It began with a particular philosophy and of kind of dominating nature, so that by dominating nature, we should be able to have kind of more freedom. We should be eliminating wants. We should be able to have human flourishing. Those are kind of the goals that are kind of set during the scientific revolution, and explicit in the writings of Bacon, Descartes, and Galileo, and many others. And for a while, it took hundreds of years to figure out what's wrong with that, until we came to this point where we have, extreme weather events in the form of climate disasters or climate change as a whole, and destroying the planet. Then we realized, wow, having the right conception of nature, having the right relationship with nature does matter. No one today would dare talk about nature in terms of domination. But now with AI business, what is happening is kind of repetition of the same thing. Now, instead of nature, we're focusing on a human being. We're focusing on a human being as a data. Just as people who talk about for centuries, by the way, it's all in literature, uncovering the secrets of nature so that, you can kind of have progress and so forth. Now they're talking about human beings in terms of data, so that, they can solve all the problems, they can bring unlimited prosperity and the same set of promises. I'm just afraid, I'm just not sure where this is going to lead us. Yeah, so this is, let me kind of summarize. I think I've already spoken a lot. So if you think about the nature of consciousness from the perspective that I'm presented here, it seems kind of impossible to build an AI with human level consciousness. And moreover, in an AI-dominated world, people are increasingly influenced by reductionist and materialistic machine-oriented views of self, consciousness, intelligence, and personhood, because the NAT, or AI, hardly provides non-Eurocentric Western perspectives on these issues. And then, as I said, it's leading to a phenomenon called the pancake self, and then the manipulative mindset. Before it was nature, now it's the human brain. And finally, you also see the indifference of the AI community most of the time regarding the ethical consequences of this situation. All right, I'll stop here, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was really wonderful. This is the shortcoming in having something online. Here comes the applause. Dr. Faruque, we have a number of questions for you in our Q&A, and they're ranked now in terms of sort of popularity. So they've been upvoted. So I'll go ahead and read the first, coming to us from Mason Cash. If it's a question of ethics, what would a machine need to be able to do ethically to deserve the benefit of the doubt as we give to humans in being treated as though it has a self or consciousness, or the right to be treated as an end in itself and not merely as a means to an end? Is it possible for a non-human intelligence to have a self in this way? And there's a follow-up that he's written here. I can read that too. Regarding your points about self, GPT-4 has given wise ethical advice, has instinctive knowledge, can give an aesthetic evaluation of a piece of art, and can give compassionate advice in handling grief. It even passed professional sommelier exams. Do these kinds of abilities reveal a self, or at least give pause when denying selfhood to a machine, irrespective of what it can do, simply because it's not human? So again, the question, is it impossible for a non-human intelligence to have a self in this way, the way that was just described?
I think that's a very good question. Actually, I would say there's an army of philosophers and intellectuals who, as I said, who kind of, in principle, they believe that it's possible to build an AI with, human level consciousness. And also, they have already started to talk about the morality in relation to machines, like what should we do in terms of the rights of machines. So just as we talk about human rights, we should be able to talk about the rights of machines. So yeah, so I find it, I don't know, like how to even react to such. I mean, because you see very complicated discussions, papers being written about these topics, about something so hypothetical. Even if you believe in principle, you should be able to build, but it's not like it's going to happen in the near future, like 10, 15 years. We're not, the present situation is very far from that kind of super optimistic scenario. As I said, you can kind of ask the experts. They themselves, most of them will tell you that even if in principle you're able to do it, but not, like the way they're talking about it, like in 10, 15 years. Now, I don't think you can kind of separate consciousness from these emotions, compassion and other ethical emotions. So why is it that we, for example, when it comes to human relationships, we talk about ethics? Because when we, for example, when we hurt a human being, when we say something really, let's say make a racist comment, from the appearance you can tell whether someone is conscious or they're hurt or not. But so you don't even need some type of philosophical arguments to see that. Now a machine can kind of give you, just produce statements based on, as I say, it works on prediction models. It can predict the next word in the sequence because it has trained itself on all these potential scenarios. But that's very different from having real consciousness with all of its concomitants in the form of emotions. So when the questioner says that the ChatGPT 4 already proved somehow it can provide aesthetic judgment and so forth. I mean, of course, I don't agree with that. It's one thing to feed the machine with all of these responses, and it can even self-train itself, but quite another to kind of claim that it has now become kind of sentient. If you really claim that a machine has become sentient, then you should be able to see all the features of consciousness that I've kind of elaborated, not just its mathematical computational ability, which you're able to replicate. For example, even there, when it comes to language, I gave the example of how a child learns a language versus how a machine kind of masters a language. And then the example of how we think, how machines are not able to think. Thinking involves all of these complicated mental structures. So it's one thing to kind of come up with a model that can apparently fool us with a lot of these answers, and quite another to be able to see, for example, reflexivity. I don't see in ever like a machine which is able to kind of turn its gaze upon itself. It's just impossible. And think about intentionality. That's not to say we can build. We have already built all very complicated machines, AI-driven drones, for example, that can track you just as you see in sci-fi films, and that can do much better job than a human does. But that does not make these machines a human being. So the question of ethics would not. It's just, to me, it's irrelevant. And to me, it shows how deep this mechanistic and dualistic view that Descartes and his ilk in the 17th century has laid out for us. And we still think, it's consciousness, some kind of emergent phenomena. Just consciousness is kind of something mechanical. Life is also can be understood only in mechanical, chemical terms. But if you probe deeper, even from the narrow scientific perspective, just look at how many different definitions you have today about life. So talking about life, consciousness, you can't escape the question of life. You can't escape life in general, not just in human beings, but also with respect to plants, animals, and so forth, in the universe as a whole. And we still don't have any answers if you're following the materialistic trajectory. There is no answer to some of these basic questions. So I would say, yeah, it's a long way from now.
Well, thank you for that. The next question is proposed by Raza Ali. What are your thoughts on the recent open letter proposing a pause on AI technologies more powerful than GPT-4?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I think I hear even a lot of the people like Eric Schmidt and people like him calling for more rigorous regulations. So because these technologies are developing, for example, ChatGPT 4, initially they said, it's going to come, they're going to announce it next year. And then, but they just announced it this month, last month, I believe. So to keep up with the pace of technology and the developments that are happening, rapid developments, so it would not be a bad idea. But again, it's hard to control each and every individual on this planet about these technologies. So somehow they're going to pop up. So the governments, as many people have already pointed out, they need to really, really form a regulation body. There are already some, but we need more regulatory actions, procedures in place about these programs.
Great, thank you. And the next question is from Atticus Garrison. Even if AI does not have consciousness or a sense of self and will never have the ability to attain such states of being, does that matter in a practical sense to the general public or to the technology companies that are marketing these models? We already live in a world where AI is complex enough to imitate human responses to the point where it even tricks its own engineers. And here's the question in a more straightforward way. How do we explain that it is a magic trick to people who want to believe that the magic is real?
I would not go that far to call it a magic or magic trick, but yeah, I think the question is a very salient one, because as I said, we have come to a point where a lot of people, even seemingly intelligent people, seem to believe that we are nothing but biological machines. So the whole point, sorry I took extra time, but I've written an entire book and also 2 articles on AI, ChatGPT, on these things, and hoping to write a book, monograph on AI in the next few years. We have come to a point where we simply identify with ourselves as biological machines, or some kind of flattening out of the pancake cell, as if there's nothing deeper than that, as if all of these kind of literatures around the inner self, around the mystery of consciousness, is just kind of irrelevant. So that's because as I said, the line between machines and human beings have already, has been blurred already, and so people have, perhaps most of us have lost touch with our inner self. We simply think that we're nothing but the brain, and the brain also works most in a mathematical fashion, and there's a computational ability which defines the self. And so if you're able to replicate somehow mathematical reasoning through all these complex algorithms, then somehow we're actually creating human machine. But as I pointed out, when we think about the human self, it's not the rational machine-like way of thinking. It's also the irrational part, or what philosophers have called the third factor, the absurdity principle. It's not like we always behave in a rational way. We behave sometimes in a very irrational manner, sometimes in a super rational manner. There's something called self-sacrifice. I mean, how you're going to incorporate compassion itself. I don't know, someone pointed out, oh, the machine has already become. Yeah, to me, that's just impossible to kind of even believe that, yeah, there are people who actually believe that, machines are already behaving in a compassionate way. If we define compassion through some kind of mathematical equation, yeah, but what is a real compassion? What are human emotions? So these things need real study, and humanities, and this has to do also the education system again. Humanities perhaps are not doing a good job on explaining human nature. So we have a very caricatured view of human nature. And as I said, yeah, to some extent, does it matter? So I gave the example of deep fake AI, the Unreal Keanu. It has millions. Even though a lot of people know that this is a fake Keanu Reeves, but they still want. It really reminds me of Cypher, the character Cypher in the Matrix. As you know, he was the only human, or one of the few human, who was actually content to live in a machine matrix because he felt so tired with humans. And you hear philosophers. So philosopher Robert Nozick, I think Nozick has this idea of pleasure machine. So it's a hypothetical situation where you connect to the machine and you're able to experience everything you want, all forms of pleasure, imaginal, intellectual, physical, whatever. So if you have that kind of situation, would you prefer to live your entire life in that pleasure machine in a virtual reality where you get what you want, and there are already kind of apps to facilitate that, or will it still matter? Because it's the question of what is real. So I think that's something we need to think about. Unfortunately, people can be persuaded. They can be manipulated. So a lot of people simply seem to don't care because they don't have a clue that when we probe deeper into the self, there are all these domains in the hidden windows that will keep our lives busy for millennia. Actually, if we really are looking for self-knowledge, but we seem to be having very shallow definition of the self, and hence people are thinking, oh, the game is over already. Machines are going to rule and so forth. And let's talk about hypothetical ethics and those things. Yeah.
So thank you for that. I think we have time for one or two, maybe one, maybe two more answers, because we're supposed to be done by around 4:15. So this one comes to us from Louis Favela. Apologies if I missed this, but when you say consciousness, do you only mean human consciousness? If so, do your points apply to non-human consciousness, like non-human animals, like apes, dogs, etc. as well? Are you open to LLMs having non-human consciousness? Thank you.
So I partially touched on this. So no, I mentioned a few times about the interconnectedness of life, consciousness, existence, not in the context of reality as a whole. So I began with the idea that consciousness is fundamental in the order of reality. It's not mind which gives, again, it's a contentious point. There are all of these theories of emergence of consciousness from matter. But again, it's not like you have decided any one of these sides, contending sides were able to decisively prove one way or the other. And yeah, but the features that I was talking about, both mind and consciousness, they apply specifically to human consciousness and also higher forms of consciousness than even human beings, but not machines. But I would say yes, consciousness, just like life, is present all through the universe. Now there are theories like information integration, cognitive neural theories of consciousness, like the one developed by Tononi, where for him there is a kind of consciousness meter. And he's a kind of panpsychist. So everything has consciousness, even stones and computers. Even computers are more conscious because they're able to integrate. So the question is about the integration of information. So obviously, computer contains sometimes way more information than human beings. But does that mean computers are conscious? So that's very problematic. But that's not to say there is no consciousness in nature when it comes to non-human animals. So I do believe consciousness is ubiquitous, but it comes in different grades. You will not have reflexibility. You will not have full-fledged consciousness, all these modalities in non-human animals, but you will have consciousness in non-human animals as well. And some are increasingly more sophisticated, like the ones you see in dolphins, in elephants. There are experiments done about, performed about these things. So yeah, consciousness is it's intertwined with the nature of reality itself. And you cannot separate intelligence and life and information as well. Yeah, I would make a distinction between information, knowledge. But anyway, these things are things become more mysterious if we began with the Cartesian understanding of mind and matter, that radical separation. But if we began with the idea that the universe is already conscious, already given all these sophisticated forms of consciousness and knowledge and about species, and then gradually things emerge, then it begins to look less mysterious and begins to make more sense. But in that paradigm, I would not say machines are also something that is able to develop consciousness at some point. No, that's not something that's the point that I was arguing against.
Okay, thank you. And last question. This one is from Leslie Peterson. Thank you for this informative and well thought out talk. Regarding human consciousness, you mentioned compassion. This has been a point that I keep coming back to. One main difference that I see between a human consciousness and that of an AI centers around empathy. I have a sense of empathy because I know what it feels like to be embodied. If someone is in pain, I understand that and have an impulse to want to alleviate it. But how can an AI feel empathy when it has no idea of being embodied in the way that an organic being does? You mentioned self-luminosity. It may be aware of itself, but can it have any concept of what it feels like to live in an embodied state? In other words, what reason would it have to care about anyone and modify its actions to avoid harm? Given that limitation, if it is one, would we really be able to categorize it as a consciousness?
So I completely agree. That's the whole point. So AI is already able to replicate some features of consciousness, notably the way, some form of language capacity, some form of reasoning. But even there, as I said, I argued, it's not able to think. It'll never be able to think. Thinking, I gave a simple example, but thinking is ultimately about understanding universals. Excuse me. And it's a very complex topic. Regardless of our philosophical orientations, whether we're we come from a modern analytic background, a continental or Aristotelian or Buddhist, whatever, on some level, this question, there's at least convergence, like the complexity of thinking and what structures of mind we have to presuppose for that. So when we're doing AI, we are only limiting ourselves to the computational ability, the analytic function of intelligence, but its synthetic ability alongside the emotions and so forth and the irrational tendencies. Basically, people would have to create another form of let's say Frankenstein or a machine with real human life or consciousness. But for that to happen, we have to first of all answer. There has to be some kind of agreement. What is life? What is consciousness? Why is it that even within the scientific material, just do a quick research on what is life? So many even at this point in history, at least 100 different definitions of life, and we claim that we have progressed to the point of solving all the mysteries and so forth. So we are. If we don't even know, if we don't have an agreement, what constitutes human consciousness, then how can we even begin to talk about creating a replica? Now, if we define human beings in such a reductionist way, as if it's nothing more than a calculator or ChatGPT, of course we already have AGI, we already have and we'll have superintelligence, of course. But that's just, it's like I always give this example because people always use it in science, because they use mathematical language and they think that poetry or other forms of knowing about nature are just irrelevant or subjective. It's like using a metal detector. So it's good at detecting objects, metallic objects using electromagnetism or other what have you. But does this mean if you go out into the nature and trying to detect water and various natural phenomena with a metal detector, you'd be successful? Of course you'll not. But will you then claim that, just because I'm not able to detect this with my metal detector, with my mathematical, whatever algorithm, logic, whatever models, then there is no such thing as water in nature. There's no such thing as spring. There's no such thing as beauty and so forth. So is the case. So there are already people like Roger Penrose. I don't agree with him completely, but even within that paradigm, he has argued forcefully, as far as I'm concerned, using Gödel's incompleteness theorem, how you can never have AI with human consciousness. So there are all of these arguments to think about, I guess.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for a really thought-provoking talk and question and answer. It's been an absolute pleasure. I know for myself, and I'm sure for all those who attended. And thank you, the audience and those participating. Thank you for coming and joining us today. Have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.